through now.
Did everybody hear the automated voice?
Something coming through.
Marilyn,
Yep.
because you are a host, are you able to see some attendees there?
I got 6 participants. Attendees, I've got none. Oh, because I haven't started the webinar yet, though. So I don't know if it'll show me until we have them. I can see all the panelists. Should I start it?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting now. Okay. So I'll be able to see attendees now. Yep, it's growing. Got
Growing? Okay.
Yep. So for those who are joining us, we're just waiting on everyone to come along and we'll get started.
973. 37973. Invalid password. Just take it out. Can I ask what the password is to get in for people?
Sure. We might put it on the chat as well, just in case other people need it too. I'll just get it. Bill, the password is 03
03
79.
7973.
Yep.
It's not working. Sign in.
Ah.
Invalid email.
You should just be able to click the link. They'll have to click the link that was sent to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done that.
Don't worry.
Bill, you have 2 links though, so you might need to click if for another device to join the original link, which I can forward to you.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. But I registered for the. You're going to see. Yeah. Okay. Turn it. Don't worry, Marilyn. Forget it. It's okay.
Okay. All good.
In the next life, I'm planning to be able to understand all this stuff.
All good. It's all good, Bill. We're all still learning too. Anna from Canberra. Hi, Anna. We'll give it another minute or so for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. If you'd like, while you're logging in, feel free to just say hello in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from.
Oh. No. What's the password?
Where's my phone? 3. 7973. But it doesn't seem to work.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello and welcome everyone to the 80th anniversary of the YCW in Australia. In 1939, Kevin T. Kelly published a brochure, Jock, Young Christian Workers, which sold 15,000 copies in a short few months. Within those months, a group of young Melbourne priests had adopted the Cardijn methodology, leading to the official foundation of the Australian YCW in Melbourne in 1941. In the early years, sport was the chosen medium by which the movement reached out to young people. In later years, the YCW confronted the social issues of the times, particularly relating to apprenticeships, refugees, and migrant workers. As the times changes, so did the social issues, such as unemployment, English classes, and climate justice. And throughout the history of the YCW in Australia, it has been important for us to connect and pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land. Now, can we take a moment to pay those respects? As we enter this sacred space, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. Their footsteps were here long before our shoe prints. Their handprints were here centuries before our buildings rose. Their hearts loved and broke in this country, generations before our violent settlements and sorrows. Their cultural authority and traditions were established long before our communities of relationship leadership came to be. We call upon their spirit ancestors and our own ancestors who have gone to God to be with us as we share, learn, and celebrate together. May we walk gently on this land. We also welcome Christ who comes to us as the visitor, the stranger, the young worker, the refugee, the asylum seeker, the migrant, and those still offshore awaiting our welcome on shore. I also now ask us to take a moment to compose ourselves before we enter into prayer. As most of you are aware, we are in a modern YCW with brothers and sisters joining us from multi-faith backgrounds who stand together with us as one movement. I'd like to ask those of us who are not of the Catholic faith to take this opportunity to reflect with us as we praise the YCW opening prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, pray through you, to live in you, to give you all my strength and all my time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, farms, workshops, offices, and in all our homes. Be everywhere better known, better loved, better served. Deliver us from injustices and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labour's battlefield rest in peace. Joseph Cardijn, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. My name is Sean Garrick, and I'm the National Secretary of the YCW Australia, a position which I have held since our last National Council in January of 2020. I joined the YCW straight after leaving school, where before that, I was a young YCS leader. I'm a cabinet maker by trade, but see myself more as a student of the world. Our first speaker is Bill Armstrong. Bill grew up in country Victoria on a sheep farm in Alexandria. From 1958 till his marriage in '63, he worked with the Young Christian Workers movement. He worked as an extension worker, as a full-time Melbourne secretary and president, and then as national president, before working in the international YCW office in 1974 and '75. He also played a couple of games for the Carlton Football Club. Post this, he had a long, fulfilling career with the Australian Volunteers International, where he became CEO until he retired in 2002. After his retirement, Bill continued to be involved in volunteer work and is a life member of Action Aid Australia and the Australian Council for International Development. In 2003, Bill was made an officer in the General Division of the Order of Australia for service to the international community under provisions of overseas aid and relief through Australian Volunteers International, and for fostering greater understandings of different cultures and raising awareness of social justice and human rights. So please, let us welcome Mr. Bill Armstrong.
Mute. Technology. Got me. Thank you, Sean. Hi to everybody. I like also to recognise and thank the traditional custodians of the land that we're on, each and every one of us. We need to do this because we've never negotiated a treaty with the First Peoples of this country, and that's still a running sore. As without a treaty, we still carry the mark of terra nullius, that is empty land, which is both a lie and a travesty against those people who nurtured this land for some 60,000 years. It is therefore important that we continually remind ourselves of that fact. When I was asked to give this talk, I sat down and my maths were good enough for me to work out that it's 70 years this year since I first came across the YCW, which is approximately 10 years after it began. It's 60 years ago, I was a full-timer, and 64 years ago, when I first met Cardijn in Europe in 1957, and then again when he came to Australia in 1958. So it's a long time ago. Those days were for me a time of formation and learning. Like many who have been through the YCW say, the YCW was my university. It provided me with a formation for life rather than a training for a job, which is what really happens nowadays through our education system. It was education based, firstly, on what I already knew and built on that to expand my knowledge and to give me confidence that I could work to change things and that I had the ability to do that. In other words, it was experiential learning. I'm talking about a time just following World War II, and Australia was in a rebuilding phase, perhaps similar to today after COVID-19. Young people of my day were looking for recreational activities. Jobs were not too difficult to find. Hence, there was a fairly big emphasis on sport and entertainment. And this was the catchment area for young people, for the YCW, because the YCW provided services in those areas. There was also a need, as there is today, for young couples to find homes and to be assisted with their finances. And the YCW assisted in the establishment of cooperatives. Remember, all these services were services that were run by the members themselves. The housing and financial services were cooperatives. We don't see too many of them around today. The YCW flourished at that time and spread right through the country. With the exception of Sydney Archdiocese, there would hardly be another diocese that did not encourage the establishment of the YCW and support it with full-time chaplains. Here in Melbourne, during my time working for full-time, there were, in the 50s and 60s, there were some 200 parishes, and there would have hardly been a parish that didn't have a YCW boys and a YCW girls group. It's also worth recalling that the age grouping in the beginning, in the early days, was 14 or 15 to 18 or 19. I was 15 when I joined the YCW, and that was the start of my apprenticeship as a fitter and turner. As the movement matured and gained more confidence, issues related to young people were more researched and examined, and the organisation began to take on much more a campaigning model. Throughout its history, the Australian YCW has campaigned on issues relating to working conditions, and the second national campaign in 1946 was in actual fact on the subject of work. And since then, the YCW has launched regular campaigns to promote the dignity of work, improving the quality of apprenticeships, the conditions of work, and in more recent times, of course, the impact of casualisation. During the 60s and 70s, just to mention a couple of the campaigns which most of those of you listening today will know about, there was the road safety campaign, which was of major concern, certainly here in Victoria. Some 3,000 people, many of them young people, young workers, being killed on the road. And the Melbourne YCW campaigned along with the wider community to bring about change, which led to things like the seatbelt, the road safety traffic authority, etc. In the 70s, the YCW established a consumer group aimed to focus on the tactics of a major retail chain at that stage, Walton's. They Walton's concentrated on housing commission areas and used pressure tactics and weekly instalments to induce the customers to buy. There were sit-ins and demonstrations organised by the YCW, and the campaign was a success, and Walton ceased to operate in about 1985. Today, of course, we have the whole new phenomena of afterpay and all its offshoots. Between 65 and 72, some 64,000 Australians, young Australians, were called up for national service, a compulsory selective conscription. The selection was via a ballot based on a date of birth, and people were balloted out, and many of those young people were sent to Vietnam. As this impacted on many young Australians and their families, the YCW took a position on the war and joined the large grouping of Australians who opposed the war and also the compulsory conscription. I think it's important to say that the Australian YCW has always understood itself to be part of the international movement, and from very early on participated at the regional and international level. Over the years, there have been a number of Australian YCW people who have taken on international and regional YCW responsibilities. Some of those are online today, I know. I don't have time or the ability to go through and name them all, but suffice it to say, as early as the 1950s and 60s, there were a number of extension workers from Australia working in India, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, South Africa. Others played important roles over the years as international and regional team members. As Sean mentioned, I had the good fortune to work at international headquarters as an editor of Info. I actually said I went to the international headquarters to learn to read and write, and I think it did help me to read and write. I didn't do much reading before those days. Through these connections, the Australian YCW was and is very aware of the injustices in many overseas countries and gave support to YCW members in those countries as they fought for justice and liberation and human rights, including Vietnam, South Korea, South Africa, Brazil, Chile, and other places. And I'm talking about the YCW of my time, or around my time and just after my time. YCW members in those countries were working for human rights, and they suffered a great deal in those days. As a result, the Australian YCW became actively associated with their causes and for example, were involved in the anti-apartheid movement and campaigned and demonstrated here in Australia, and became involved in the overseas aid question, supporting the increase of Australian government aid to developing countries. I think it's important to recall that at that time in history, it was just post-Vatican II, where the church gave voice to a church of the people through its documents on the church in the modern world, and referred to the church as the people of God. As is known now, Cardijn had a great influence on the council, and Stefan Gigas, who's I can see there, has written extensively on this. It was also a time of the rise of liberation theology in Latin America, where the YCW and the people in general were fighting for their rights and suffering a great deal. Liberation theology was the complementary for us to the YCW methodology. Those of us in the YCW in the late 50s and 60s were extremely excited at these changes and believed that Vatican II provided support for the Cardijn methodology and movement of social justice and human rights, and that those organisations, along with the YCW, would be given more support to continue to work in these areas. Unfortunately, however, that was not to be true. There was a reaction to Vatican II approach, and a large section of the church regarded these activities as too political and, dare I say, leaning towards communism. And in the YCW case, it was apparently at that time not Catholic enough. Particularly here in Australia, the church was very much influenced by what is known as the Santa Maria anti-communist organisations, and the YCW was regarded as opposition, resulting in the church, both here and in Australia and overseas, reducing and finally ceasing support for the movement. This is a big subject, and I know that there will be, of course, different views about it, but it had an incredible impact, not just on the YCW, but on all those social justice movements. By the early 80s, most Catholic organisations working in the human rights and justice area were receiving very little support from the institutional church. I won't go through the organisations. I always say that most of the organisations I had anything to do with lost their support, and maybe I was the common denominator, I don't know. While the YCW works to change what is happening in society that is detrimental to young people, and works to change unjust structures and enables youth to take responsibility for their own lives, the Cardijn methodology, in my opinion, is fundamentally an educational methodology that forms its participants for life. It's an educational process that, of course, encourages people to be aware of what's happening around them. And in my day, the reflection and value setting came out of the studies of the Gospels and the Catholic Church social teachings. In my view, it doesn't have to come from there. It's a question of young people identifying what their value structures are. It's a circular process that's continually repeated throughout your life. Cardijn used to say that every day you start again. Every day you start again. I can hear him saying it. And that becomes part of your very being. You start again, you review, you look at what's happening, you review, and you take action. It's very interesting that the see, judge, and act methodology, which is basic to Cardijn, of course, has been picked up and taken by lots of other organisations and people in different words. In fact, I was sent an article yesterday in which it says it's a business, American business article, and it says that they talk about the 3 A's: awareness, analysis, action. Awareness, see; analysis, judge; action. Exactly the same. As I've already said, YCW and Cardijn had an enormous influence on my life, the whole of my life. This is the subject. I'm not going to talk about my life too much in the YCW. It's a subject of a book that's been written and hopefully will be produced. So I'm plugging the book now. It's a book about my experience coming out of the Cardijn methodology and how I attempted to put that into practice throughout my career. My career can be broadly broken into 2 areas: development and then working with First Nations people. I spent a huge part of my life working in the area of what is called aid and development. What Cardijn taught me is that those are not the same thing. Aid and development are different things. Development is about liberation. It's about people and communities taking control of their own lives. It's about self-determination, whereas aid is welfare and charity. Don't get me wrong, there is a place for welfare and charity. But if we really want to bring about lasting change, then the people must do it themselves. And development is that. It's a key principle that Cardijn preached in the case of the role of the priests in the YCW. And it holds true for any community development worker. Cardijn said, the priest in the YCW was nothing. We liked that when we heard that. And yet the priest was everything. And the community development worker is nothing. But without them, you don't have the formation and the leadership. This principle always holds true as far as I'm concerned. It's not only for young people, it's a community development method of being everything and nothing. Some of you will remember Paul Willey, who was a Catholic priest at the time and chaplain to the YCW. Paul used to say his job was to pronk. He had to pronk people. Again, an American journal talks about nudging. And of course, some people who know me might say that I was shoving, not nudging on occasions. Working with First Nations people, as I said in the opening, this is a huge area for our nation. And while we spend an enormous amount of dollars on what we call Indigenous affairs, very little of it gets into the hands of First Nations people to enable them to work for their own development. For 20 years, I was part of an organisation that was set up by government to transfer skills to Indigenous people in communities by sending in volunteers. Gradually, we started to realise, well, the whole organisation began to realise that's not what you do. That there's a lot of people willing to go and work as volunteers, but there's not a lot who understand the basic principles of development or liberation and self-determination. At one stage, there was something like 1,000 projects around Australia with volunteers going in and out. But we changed the nature of the organisation, and the principle now is, again, that you don't do things to people, you don't do things for people, you do things with people, which is a fundamental principle of community first development, that organisation. It was a huge privilege for me to have the opportunity to work with First Nations people. And I learnt an enormous amount. Just 2 learnings that I think are absolutely fundamental is their commitment to family and community is paramount, whereas the rest of us in this land are very individualistic. Secondly, their belief in country, in land. The land is my mother. I belong to the land. The land does not belong to me. This is a concept so basic to a healthy and vital environmental approach, which we must learn. In my opinion, Cardijn's methodology and Cardijn is as relevant today as it ever was. There is, of course, a need. I'm looking at the time. There is, of course, a need for many more people to have the opportunity to learn and be part of the work of the Cardijn method, using the Cardijn methodology. There's where I move. I'm sorry, I'm just dropping out some stuff because I realise at time. During COVID, we've learnt that those people who have been named as essential service people are in the main the most exploited and least rewarded. Yet all the talk is about returning to normal. Is this not the chance to challenge now what in the past we accepted as normal and begin to work towards a much more equal society? Our government at the moment is telling us there's lots of jobs available, but most of them are insecure, casual, gig economy and labour hire positions, which pay less than the equivalent of a full-time position and have no rights attached to them. The government has also legislated in past times to entrench the use of insecure work, and through government subsidies assisted many Australian companies and individuals to increase their wealth and therefore increase the inequality. This leads to inequality in education and health services, and compounded by that is mental health and the use of drugs. This is not just to mention the elephant in the room like climate change, the treatment of refugees, or the international isolation of this country as we treat our neighbours as traders rather than friends. There are three groupings of people who, in my opinion, are on what I call on the doorstep of taking control of change. They are women, First Nations people, and youth. And why do I say that? Because they are the ones that are most affected by all these things. I could say more about that. While Cardijn might not have all the answers, there is no doubt that the fundamentals of people having a voice and people participating in their own development are key to bringing about change. In conclusion, I want to say thank you to those who worked together to put on this webinar. I believe it is important that those of us and those organisations who believe in the Cardijn theology and methodology work together to try and understand how that can be implemented today. Cardijn was not just the founder of the YCW. His approach gave birth to a large number of organisations at that time, and many of which no longer exist. A favourite motto of mine, which I came across in Canada watching the Blue Jays baseball team, which I've been known to say it's a bit like watching flies crawl up a wall, is consider the past, understand the present, and make the future. Let those of us who have been influenced by Cardijn and organisations influenced by Cardijn, the YCW and other Cardijn-based organisations, consider its influence on us, celebrate that, but don't let's wallow in the past. Let's take the next step and understand the present reality, and then, as the motto says, make the future. For young people listening, let me say, don't be captured by the thinking that you are the future. You can be and are the change makers of today. There are some very good examples of young people providing leadership and taking action to change the world of inequality. And I encourage you to work with them and introduce them to Cardijn so that they will be provided with the tools to continue to work for development and self-determination right through their lives. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. It's very enlightening to see and hear so much of the experience that you've had and shared with us today. Our next speaker is Marilyn Bellett. Marilyn and I attended school together and both joined the movement at the same time. So I've had the opportunity to watch her grow, develop, and form new and upcoming leaders in the movement. Throughout the past 6 years, Marilyn has answered the call to action, becoming Parramatta YCW President, National Secretary, Melbourne Extension Worker, and now currently the National President. Throughout all these roles Marilyn has been in, she has been an inspiration not only to young women, but to all young people that have the opportunity to review, see, judge, and act with her. Marilyn may be young, but she has already shared so much with the movement and has so much more to share. So without further ado, Marilyn Bellett.
Thanks for that, Sean. And thanks, Bill, for sharing that with us too. I think it's a great privilege to be here tonight. And good evening, everyone who's joining us as well. Thank you to all of you for participating tonight as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the YCW in Australia. As Sean mentioned, my name is Marilyn, and before I share my own story with you, I would first like to acknowledge and pay respects to Indigenous elders past, present, and emerging. Their story, traditions, practices, and way of life spans across thousands of years, and their continued connection and stewardship of this land and these waters long precedes our migration and settlement. I also recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. I'm meeting on the land of the Darug people, and I extend my respects to all First Nations people present today. May we walk gently on this land. My name is Marilyn Bellett. I'm 24 years old, born in Western Sydney, Darug land, as a first-generation Goan Anglo-Indian Australian woman, and I am the national president of the YCW. I'm sure many of you would resonate with me when I say that the YCW has played a pivotal role in my life so far. I've called the YCW home for 6 years, and before joining the YCW, I was a leader of my local YCS group for 2 years. This movement, this methodology, and this community have been fundamental to my development as a young woman and to the expression of my faith and connection to the Catholic Church. I'd like to share with you all some of my story and that of some of my friends. While I personally feel I am at a crossroads in my life, I acknowledge that the YCW today is at a very similar stage in its journey. I know the path behind us, and I see lots of paths ahead of us, but the path behind me is intertwined with my life, and the future paths hold so much promise and potential. I feel I've grown up in the Cardijn movements. I was guided from my childhood into my young adulthood, as I was guided from the YCS into the YCW. I spent most, if not all, of my formative years, my entire young adulthood up until this point, in the YCW. I've learned how to reflect on my actions, how to build and sustain a community, how to pick myself up, ask for help, how to confront intimidators, and how to agitate. I've learned how to believe in myself, how to trust and rely on others, how to recognize my self-worth, how to defend my peace, face my fears, and break generational curses. I'm at the cusp of my career and adulthood, my whole future ahead of me, and I've had the best preparation that any young person could possibly receive when they get to where I'm standing right now. And it's all because of the YCW. You see, the YCW has played a massive role in my life. I come from a family that is marred by trauma, which has been passed down from generation to generation, from seeking refuge and living in poverty in India, to migrating and settling in the new multicultural Australia, a country which sadly still had remnants of white Australia policy thriving. My parents left all that they knew so that they could have a better life, a reality that has come into young people in my generation. But it wasn't always a better life. My mother taught us how to survive and consistently placed her children above her own mental health and well-being and her own dreams and comfort. In her culture, this is what a mother and a wife does. And as her only daughter, I spent most of my life asking myself if I was to inherit this role. Is this my destiny? And while the YCS laid important foundations for my young adulthood, it was the YCW that challenged me to question everything, with my faith guiding me. In this time, I've advocated for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, organized young people to come together and campaign for better workplaces and more human-centered policies around workers' rights and temporary visa holders. I've protested and rallied with my fellow comrades to oppose unjust laws and to advocate for better climate justice policies. I've worked with the Australian Catholic bishops to help them understand the needs and concerns of young people. And I've been fortunate enough to have been a part of something that is so much bigger than myself. More recently, and thanks to a friendly conversation with Bill, I have come to understand the power of storytelling in generating understanding, the common ground of change making. What I didn't expect along my journey was to also learn how healing it is to be able to make sense of your own story and how important it is to then tell that story so that others can do the same. You see, the YCW has taught me to live by example, through actions and not just words, like Bill said. And for a young Catholic woman, this has become my central connection to living out my faith and remaining connected to the Australian Catholic Church. Where many of my peers have become disenfranchised, my involvement in the YCW has facilitated a deep and genuine connection to my faith, and has done the same for many other young people in the movement today. I've been educated about feminism and the equitable rights of women in the workplace and in all aspects of society. And my life has changed forever. The YCW is helping me to learn to understand my parents, confront deep-seated trauma, and to be a confident and brave young leader. Today, I work for a government agency that supports and addresses the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse communities, just like my parents when they first arrived in Australia. And now I have the opportunity to provide support for families as they settle in New South Wales. And in so many ways, I feel like I can support my parents in the way that they would have needed someone when they first arrived in the country. There are so many reasons why the YCW needs to continue existing. I, for one, cannot accept a world without the YCW forming young people to take on the challenges that we will face as we continue to inherit systemic issues. There are so many young people like me in the YCW today who have been so profoundly impacted by the movement, and we know the realities that would have been ours had it not been for the YCW. Many of our members face realities of exploitation, lives of inequity, sexism, and gender-based violence. Many of us would have given up hope of saving the planet and would not have understood the connection between that and the working class. We would have given into materialism, capitalism, and throwaway culture. Many, if not all of us, would not be conscious of the need to care for our own mental health and well-being, the number one concern for young Australians today, especially given what we've just been through with COVID. Take Umez, our national vice president, for example. Umez comes from a background where the closest he had to learning about workers' rights was when he studied about the ILO in high school. Understanding the struggle of the working class was limited to learning about the anger and frustrations of Nepalese and Indian subcontinent migrant construction workers in Qatar. Umez says that without the YCW, the reality he faced as a migrant worker on a student visa would have been taken as the normal struggle that workers from his background would face in the Australian labor market. The struggle, exploitation, and wage theft faced by temporary migrant workers, at least by international students, has been very much normalized, especially in Adelaide. The YCW educated Umez, helped him understand the concept of class and his identity and dignity as a worker belonging to the working class. Without that education, the young 25-year-old unaware of workers' rights, fearful and struggling with the reality in a foreign country, would have always compromised his self-dignity for basic survival. Umez now works for Vinnie's, and he may not identify with the Christian faith, but understands the common values and shared ideals that was instilled in him through the YCW. Recently, Umez traded in his high school textbook and has represented the Australian YCW at the last International Labour Conference. Then you have Achut. Achut is an up-and-coming South Sudanese leader in Melbourne YCW. She crossed paths with the YCW in 2019 through the Cultural Arts Project. As a young writer, Achut is passionate about a range of issues that impact the realities of young people, including identity, racism, mental illness, relationships, and healing, and found connection with the ideals and values espoused by the YCW. Achut has been nominated for the national team and has represented Melbourne YCW alongside a new generation of young leaders. She also recently represented the Australian YCW at the International Council, and she is an inspiring young leader, and Melbourne YCW is all the stronger because of her. These stories show that the YCW today is diverse and wonderful. Most of our members and leaders look nothing like our predecessors, and we face new and uniquely different challenges. We share different religious traditions, different ethnicities, abilities, different stories of migration and belonging, but we are connected by common values and aspirations, and the deepest desire to let goodness and justice and equity and peace flourish. In his closing speech at the 1961 International Council in Brazil, Cardijn, a revolutionary even for us today, said that the YCW must include young workers of all faith backgrounds. And in his own words, I quote, "The essential character of the YCW is to teach them by themselves, among themselves, to understand their value, to understand their mission. And that is why the great program will only be genuinely YCW if we develop the YCW in all the municipalities, in all the cities, in all the centers where young workers live. Whether they're Catholics, Buddhists, Hindus, or Muslims, we want to give all young workers of the earth the knowledge, and not simply the knowledge, but a realization of their dignity as a son of God, a collaborator of God. The YCW is not for an elite. It is not for a minority. The YCW is not for a privileged few. Today, this movement is a growing movement. We are not where we were 6 years ago. There's lots of work to be done, that is for sure, but we have been through so much over the past few years. And we are grateful for the support and friendship of YCW Holdings, the Australian Cardijn Institute, Cardijn Communities Australia, and of course, the kindness and generosity of the YCW Camp Committee, who have also been very supportive to the movement today. You challenge us, but you also help us to feel connected to our roots. As you've shared stories with us, we felt so connected to a legacy that we didn't even know we had inherited. And while we hope that young workers and our young student counterparts will make you proud, we also hope that you understand that we need to grow in our own shoes and embrace the ever-changing signs of the times. We are a movement that reflects the identity, hopes, and dreams of young people in Australia today. And this means that we are different from the YCW of the past. Their story is my story, is your story. So please trust us to respond to the challenges we face today. Don't make assumptions or speak on behalf of young workers, because we need you to empower us, to lend us your voices. We know that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And today is a reminder for us all about that. Thank you so much for all that have organized tonight's commemoration. And thank you to all who have participated in just listening to these stories. It means a lot for all of us and for all the young people who are joining this session tonight, for us to have times like this to be able to learn from you. And so I really share my appreciation on behalf of all of the Australian YCW. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Marilyn. Like I said, she still has so much more to offer our movement today. Now we'll have some time for questions, reflections, and comments. So if you'd like to make one, could you please raise your hand and type the questions into the chat, and I'll read them out to the panelists. So we have a question from Charles. Bill, how do you see political action in this age? Does it include being involved in creative business ventures? Where is the adventure and excitement for this generation? Does it go beyond survival or even personal success?
Oh, thanks, Charles. Well, for me, all the actions we take are political. I think that how do I see political action in this age? Am I all right? You hearing me? Okay. Am I on? Yeah. So that's my first. The problem is that we live in a society where partisan politics is so damning of any action that's taken. But if we're ever going to bring about change, then we are going to be involved in all sorts of political action. Just about any action you take is political in a sense. So if we're going to work for change, I guess that's part of the answer. But the creative business ventures, of course, we live in a society where young people are involved in creating business. We need business. We need people. There needs to be workplaces and so on. It's not the businesses so much. It's the intention of those businesses to. We're so much bound up with making a fortune, and there's never enough. We always need more, and that building of inequality. I mean, it's working is not just for survival. Working is creating. It's creative and creating a lifestyle for people where people are cared for and loved and so on. I think it's those sorts of principles and values that we need to bring into the ventures, bring into the business, and bring into the workplaces. I don't know whether that answers it, Charles, but that's a go at it. Very difficult question.
Thank you for that.
Can I say, sorry, you mentioned that where is the excitement? I think there's incredible excitement out there in terms of the way in which we work towards climate change, for instance, the future, the changes that need to take place, the way in which we work with Indigenous communities, the way in which we work with refugees and so on. I think there's it's a lot of hard work, but I think there's a lot of excitement in there and adventure, if you like. But as young people particularly start to take control of their own lives, that in itself is very exciting.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. We now have a question from Greg Lopez from Marilyn. Hi, Marilyn. Awesome presentation. Could you please share with us some of the YCW's current strategies to grow the movement? Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Greg. And that's a really good question that you've asked. We recognize that the movement is still in a state of reestablishing itself. And we have, I guess, a number of parts to a strategy that we're looking at, forming leaders as well as extending the movement and continuing to grow. But I think it's important to recognize that at the core of all that we do, I guess prioritizing our resources around forming leaders is always going to be a part of that growth process. And I think more recently having conversations about investing into our workers to be able to ensure, and sorry, by workers, I mean our youth engagement officers, to ensure that they have all that they need to be equipped to be supported in their roles is a really important part of that process. But also acknowledging that we continue to extend and grow the movement through action, not just words. And that's really come out of our last National Council. We came up with our campaign called Generation Connection. And of course, COVID-19 has played a big role in how we've implemented that strategy and that national campaign. But it's important to take into consideration that we are still working towards trying to grow the movement where we are currently based at the moment, but also looking to make connections between young people all over Australia in light of the impacts of COVID-19 and how that has really compounded traumas for young people as well. So in terms of, I guess it's not very much it's not a straightforward answer I can give you in regards to how we're doing it, but I'm always more than happy to have a chat with you after this to give you some more insight into what that strategy is. But I guess the underlying message there is that we're focusing on developing actions that are important and relevant to the realities of young people today. And the reason that is because young people are tired of talking. They're tired of listening to our nation's leaders talk about the things that they want to change. And so what really draws them into being a part of a movement like the YCW is actually the chance to be involved, to get your hands dirty and to take action. And really that's what we're focusing our engagement strategy on, and our, I guess, our growth strategy on as well. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much for that, Marilyn. We have another question for you from Kate Harvey. What do you see the YCW might look like in 2050?
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Kate, for that question. I love that question. I was always told when I came to the YCS and then reiterated in the YCW that this movement is a movement that welcomes dreamers, and also provides us with the skills and the tools necessary to be able to make those dreams realities in the context of our own lives. And for me, answering that question, it's a fun question to answer, but I think you're seeing elements of the movement today. For those of you who've been able to come across some of our members and leaders, and in whatever setting that might have been, you'll know that the movement that we have today is multicultural. It is, you know, we're grappling with and we're trying to understand the nature of our interfaith dialogue and questions, because we're not just made up of young people who come from the Christian tradition or a Catholic background, as I've mentioned when I was sharing Umez's story as well. And so looking into the future, what the YCW looks like in 2050, I think the movement is vibrant. I think it is relevant to the lives of young people today. And I think you can see that represented in the people that will lead this movement in the future, many of whom are beginning their journey in the movement today as our members, and even those who are our emerging leaders. But I think the movement in the YCW, I think in the future, we hope to reestablish a connection to the Catholic Church, and to many other institutions as well, that helps to solidify what the YCW wants to achieve in terms of the types of systemic injustices and inequalities that we'd like to, I guess, to agitate and face. I think the YCW of the future is confident. We know who we are, and we will look to the future knowing that we are capable of so much. So for me, it's less about, I guess we can take a lot from the past as well. And if anything, this conversation and tonight's celebration is an example of that. But I think the movement in the past is going to be strong and diverse and weird and wonderful. I think it's going to have young people from all walks of life and different backgrounds. And hopefully we can reach out to more of our Indigenous brothers and sisters as well. But for me, that's what the movement will look forward to in the future.
Thank you very much for that, Marilyn. We have a question from Tim Walsh. What can be done to obtain funding and other support from the Catholic Church? I think we'll give Bill the opportunity to answer this one.
I think hang on, am I unmuted? I am. I don't know the answer to that really, except to say that I don't think there's any doubt that one of the things that would be fantastic in support for the YCW would be to have institutional backing and support. I think that would be one of the key things. I think that the best way to get support from the Catholic Church or the Catholic bishops is to subject them to Marilyn, and all the people that Marilyn was talking about, to have them face to face with the reality of what young people can do and are doing, and what the movement is achieving today. I think that's the best way. Us old fellas, some have connections with the Catholic Church at a higher level. And I have always suggested that the thing that we can do is open the door. The thing that they can do is open the door for the Marilyns of the YCW to be able to meet with and be taken seriously by the bishops of the church.
Sorry, Sean, if I might add to that as well. I appreciate those words. Thank you, Bill. I think we're already taking some really strong steps towards not just reconnecting with the Catholic Church as an institution and rebuilding the relationship in the context of who the YCW is today. But I think, I guess there's only so much that we can do to help them understand why we need their support, and not just financially either. I should make that point. I think the church has far more to offer than just money, but I think it's really important that we take into consideration the fact that the YCW is really thinking about how we diversify our funding. But I guess the part of that equation is also relying on the church to recognize the worth of young people in this movement, but the worth of all young people connected to church or disconnected or disenfranchised from the church today. And to recognize that for many young people, and I think at various local levels, we've had these types of conversations with local bishops that for many, as I mentioned earlier, the YCW may be our only connection to church, maybe the only aspect of living out our faith in our lives for young people to still facilitate a deep connection to their faith. And I think that is, looking at, I guess, a proposal perspective, that's perhaps some of the best value that the church really needs to understand about the movement today. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Marilyn and Bill. Just in relation to that, we also had a comment from Paul Lenton, and he said, "Are we who are financially secure willing to lend material support to the movement as a contribution to the future, a monthly contribution?" So that's an interesting one. And so we have another question from Charles Rue to throw up to the panel. Is the old YCS way of teaching Cardine's method still active? Has the mass media changed the way of operating the method? Marilyn?
Yep, thanks, Sean. That's a very good question. Look, I can't speak to how the YCW operated with the methodology in the past. I can really only lean on the stories that have been shared with me and understanding from many documents and resources. But I can say that the way in which the YCW works with the methodology today, the way that we train and form and educate young people using the methodology today is a way that is relevant to young people today. And I mean, I really can't speak to if it looks very similar, if it sounds very similar, but I think it still does the job of educating and forming young people today. And if that isn't the purpose, then maybe we aren't doing it right. But for me, I think that is exactly what we are doing.
Thank you for that, Marilyn. Did you have a comment on that, Bill?
The only comment I'd have is that the Catholic Church of my day, young people were part of the parish structure. It seems to me that there's a huge body of young people nowadays in some sort of relationship with the church. I don't quite know how much, through the schooling system. And I would think that that is one of the areas. It's not the only area, but it's one of the key areas, at least within the Catholic Church, where I think there are young people who we know are taking action of all sorts of kinds on. I mean, I've got grandchildren in some of those schools who are taking action on refugee issues and so on, but they're not being assisted with that sort of education for life in the reflection that comes out of that. And I think there's a huge opening in there for the Cardijn methodology to be introduced to those people.
Thank you for that, Bill. We now have a question from Josh Lawrence. For those workers who missed out on the formation of the YCS and YCW Marilyn talked about, due to perhaps the movement being less backed or subscribed while they were students or young workers. Is there something new that needs to grow or be organised for an older cohort that can learn from the current YCW's approach? Has something like that taken off in Australia or overseas? Marilyn and Bill, would either of you like to answer that?
Marilyn.
Thanks for that question, Josh. Look, I think Bill's kind of answered this to some degree as well, talking about opportunities within our curriculum. In previous roles, working with Catholic Mission, which was a really wonderful opportunity for me to learn more about the Catholic education system and curriculum. I think there are lots of opportunities to embed the Cardijn methodology, not just in, I don't know how to articulate this, but not just, I guess, in theory, but in practice, in a lot of the formation modules that are already embedded within that structure, and really just making the most of that. But even not in a Catholic education system, looking at in state departments of education or the federal departments of education, I think we're seeing at a local level, even in Western Sydney, for example, with the local YCW and YCS movement, that they are working in state schools to be able to offer young people who may not come from a Christian tradition, who may not go to a Catholic school, the opportunity to become familiar with the methodology and to be able to practice it, as young as year 10, year 11, year 12. And that's where I started off as well. So while I had the privilege of being able to, I was aware of the YCW and the YCS when I was 10 years old because I had an older brother who was a part of the YCS before me. And that's how I knew about the movement. But for the vast majority of young people who don't have that privilege, who may not have an opportunity to connect with other groups while they're in high school, I think we can. I think there are lots of opportunities for us, and not just as the YCW, but in collaboration with our brothers and sisters in the YCS at a local level to engage in state schools. And I think there's an abundance of potential and opportunities looking at a school perspective in our education systems, both state and the Catholic education system as well. But outside of that, and as Bill has already alluded to as well, there are still lots of groups of young people who are still connected to the church, but in very different and unique ways, whether that's your local youth group, many of which that there are still those that run, or connected to a local Catholic charity that you really believe in. These are all opportunities for us to embed the YCW, I think in many ways, which the YCW methodology already is. But I think it's about, I guess, us as a movement taking opportunities to build some of those relationships with agencies like Catholic Mission, with our, Department of Education, with Catholic schools and the Catholic education system at a diocesan level, or even at a national level, to be able to facilitate opportunities like that for other students who may not have had the privileges that we have had in actually having a chance to participate in YCS groups or YCW groups in university. So I think there's a lot there, and it definitely requires a more strategic approach. And we're very grateful that we have some wonderful former members as a part of our National Management Committee who are helping us to make these types of informed decisions and strategies as well. But yeah, that was a really great question. Thanks for asking that, Josh.
Did you have anything to add, Bill?
Oh, I always have something to add, as people know. I think that there's a huge opportunity. In my day, there was a tendency for us to have a captured audience, like around the parish and so on. So you didn't have to go seeking. But I actually think that there's a lot of groupings of young people today taking action on all sorts of issues. And I think that those groups and those people are the ones that the YCW can go out to and be part of and join in with their action, because it is their action that's taking place. and begin the process there. I think it's more difficult today. I mean, in our day, the priest said you've got to come to a meeting, and so you came to a meeting, and that was the beginning of a YCW group. It's not like that anymore. But I think looking at Vinnie's and looking at all sorts of organisations, the refugee organisations that are around, and going to them and joining in with them and beginning the process. And I think, in a sense, my experience of doing that in Action Aid Australia, in Community First, was that I had to sit nothing for a long time in some of those organisations in order to be able to introduce some of the self-determination methodology. But and I'm sure a lot of young people who find themselves in trouble nowadays would welcome the opportunity to be able to take control of some of their own lives, rather than they live in a world, young people live in a world today that is very much controlled by everything around them, and very little chance for them to actually take control of their lives.
Thank you for that, Bill. We now have a question from Umas. Do you think the institutional church today is responding justly to the struggles of the working class, especially young workers? Have you identified any gaps in such response, and if any, how active you find institutional church addressing such gaps? And also, how the YCW is helping fill such gaps? That one's opened up for the whole board.
Yeah, anybody.
I guess to give an example, I think there are definitely, as we know, I think there are lots of gaps in how the institutional church, especially at a national level, addresses gaps of inequality at a local level. And we're coming out of the plenary council as well, and you participated in those discussions to some degree also, to share some of our insights and analysis from a YCW perspective. But I think like a really clear-cut example of where there is a gap that needs to be addressed by institutional church, that the YCW can provide some support, or at least raise some advocacy towards. If you look at a local level in some dioceses, even looking at procurement policies for cleaning staff for schools, and acknowledging that in some dioceses there may not be, I guess, procurement policies that are really reflecting the worth and dignity of young workers. And for that, I mean our international students and migrant workers, or temporary visa holders who are likely to be in gig economy roles, which we know in the fields of hospitality. And they might find themselves, cleaning in schools or in churches, and I think that's a really clear example of where the YCW acknowledges that there can be, better workplace policies, fairer wages, fairer hours of work, and just all around better working conditions for those young workers. That's something that we could advocate to local dioceses. But I think it's also something that at a national level, in terms of the institution having some knowledge and connection to a grassroots community organization like the YCW in our local diocese, where we can advocate on behalf of issues like that and be heard and actually be listened to. So like for me, I think that's one example of where there is institutional church, there are gaps there, responding justly to the struggles of the working class, and how the YCW can play a role in actually advocating on behalf of that. Bill or Stefan, would you like to add in your own reflections?
Stefan?
I wasn't sure I was going to speak right away, but yeah, very happy to intervene. Well, I definitely feel that whole gig economy thing is very important. I've had the experience, my daughter Marilyn, Jade, she finished school last year, took a gap year, started working in hospitality, in the space of 6 months, had more bad work experiences in her than I've had in my whole working life. And that really kind of struck me in a new way, what Cardijn was talking about, how when people leave school back in 1912, they're abandoned to the workplace. And I think that's really kind of, young workers might be 18 or 19 now instead of 12 or 13, but the structure is the same. What I really notice is Jade I'm a Catholic father. I sent my daughter to a good Catholic high school where she got a good education. And the day she's out the door, she's left all alone, to face all these struggles. You almost need a bachelor's degree, if not a master's degree, to work out what your work entitlements are in terms of salary and whatever else there might be. It's impossible, And in Perth, I don't know how many hours we have of a full-timer. One full-timer working a few hours, a city of 2 million people, 120 kilometres long. It's, that's another level of impossibility. So I think we really have to tackle this at that level. That's why I also put in the chat, I think it's a bit of a unique opportunity here we've got with the plenary council going on there now, and Jim Monaghan, former national chaplain, he's already raised the issue about, because he was really kind of disappointed that the plenary hadn't addressed the issue of workers and specifically young workers. But I think we have to pick up on what he said to the first assembly of the council and say, well, yeah, okay, what is the church doing? I also put in the chat, I did a little survey myself, just going onto the university websites. There's 20 people around Australia with the title of Catholic chaplain. I know they don't all work full time, probably only a few hours a week for most of them. But how many people are there in Australia, priests with the title of chaplain for the young workers? I think there's only Father Piotr, and he's also a university chaplain and other chaplains. So even that, you see the huge differential there. The church sees the need to put 20 people as chaplains into universities. One person for the young workers. I mean, what's that? This is 1912 all over again. That's what it is, and we have to put the challenge to them, and also to ourselves as alumni, as has been said in the chat. I think who made the suggestion there about the fundraising and all that. But yeah, definitely we got to come and we got to get organised too as alumni. Yeah, okay. Don't start me. I'll keep going.
The only thing I'd add is that unfortunately, it seems to me that the church has lost Cardijn, and that the church does a lot, spends a lot of money on young people, has lots of big functions and shows, and lots of money goes, and dioceses have lots of money that they put into so-called youth work. But it's not the kind of work that ends up engaging the young people. They're doing things to them, they're doing things for them, but they're not doing things with them. They're not engaging them. They're not, and it's that methodology that the church has lost. It wasn't always easy, even back in the beginnings of the days. The church would appoint priests and so on who wanted to do things for them. It's not an easy process, but it's somehow that process needs to be reintroduced somewhere. Now, whether it's reintroduced in the Catholic school system, at the Catholic university, but it needs to be understood and practiced. And of course, I think that's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, and if I might just add to what Bill's and Stefan have just mentioned as well, I think what we just identified as well, that there are some really evident structural inequalities when it comes to, I guess, the Catholic Church's response to engaging young people. I think in almost every diocese that I've worked in or met with a local bishop, engaging with young people is always a big concern that is raised. And yes, there is a lot of money that is given to, a young worker to come and be in a role of engaging young people where they're expected to, throw on events and just magically make like thousands of young people rock up to church on a Sunday. But I think the reality of that is it's not an intentional strategy for engaging young people in a genuine, relevant, and meaningful way. And what it ends up doing, because you put a young person into that context without that sort of those structural needs. And without that intention and purpose, you actually end up burning out those young workers. And they become disenfranchised with the church because of their own work experience, having worked for the church. And so what ends up being a mechanism or a way to ensure that more young people are being connected actually ends up being a way, it just becomes a revolving door for young people becoming disenfranchised from even working with the church. And that's why it's so difficult, even around procurement, to get young people into mission and formation roles, or into youth engagement roles within the church as well.
Thank you very much for that, Marilyn. We now have a question from Tony Smith. How could Pope Francis's Laudato Si be used by the YCW to activate young people? I know you, Marilyn, have spent a lot of time on this one, so if you would like to answer first.
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I do appreciate all of the questions, especially the really challenging ones. And Tony, thank you for asking this question. I think Laudato Si has already been making a very strong impact amongst our young workers, those who are already connected to the YCW and those who have becoming more connected to the YCW because of the actions and the initiatives and the review of life that is happening around Laudato Si. I know I saw it in the chat, one of our really awesome leaders in Western Sydney, Alicia, who is a leader for our Young Climate Justice Committee in Western Sydney. And she can speak to this really well. She spoke at the Mission One Heart Many Voices conference earlier this year as well, on the impact of Laudato Si and how it is a very relevant document to young people. It is a living document for young people today. But I think it's also, it can also sometimes be inaccessible to young people who aren't already connected to the Catholic Church or who don't come from a Catholic background. But in saying that, I recognize that there are many young people, even in our movement today, who aren't Catholic, who are very familiar with the Laudato Si because it's just so genuine, and it speaks to our desire to want to heal the planet, and find responses to some of the issues that we've inherited from our predecessors. So I think, I won't go, Sean knows how passionate I am about this, but I will go to say that I think it's worth really embedding this in a part of our engagement and formation strategy, especially in our Generation Connection National Campaign, which it is a part of. And that's how we've really encapsulated Laudato Si. But as always, there is more work that we can be doing at a local level and at a regional and national level to be able to review and analyze the issues that are coming out of those discussions and those activities as well, and how it's continuing even years after that document has been written and produced, how it is continuing to inspire and motivate young people to take action. And the YCW isn't just an example of where that's happening. I know of many young people outside of the YCW who are being fundamentally impacted by Laudato Si in their everyday lives and how they're advocating for change when it comes to better climate justice policies. I might leave my answer there.
Thank you, Marilyn. And Bill, how would you reflect on Laudato Si activating young people?
Oh, honestly, I don't know. I'm a little bit of a cynic, I suppose. I think that a document like that and a lot of other documents are brilliant, absolutely brilliant. The problem is I don't see the church bringing them down to reality, the reality of today. It's all very well for the Pope to write a document, as it was in Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II spelled out a church which was really a Cardijn church. It was the church of the workers, the church of the people, and so on. But the church, the institutional church, never did anything about implanting it. In fact, went in the opposite direction. So again, it's top down. It's not bottom up. I mean, if it's written from the experience of young people and others at the grassroots level. If that's where it's written from, if that's where it comes from, then it means something, because it enables and encourages and builds on what is there. But unfortunately, I read lots and lots of documents that I think are brilliant documents, but I don't see them being, I don't see that they've come academically. They haven't come out of reality.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. Our next question is from Jan Barnett, and she says, so many areas of justice use the methodology. What YCW is doing is highlighting this, and you've shown this so clearly, Marilyn. Are you doing this more formally in secondary and tertiary institutions?
Hey, Sister Jan, thanks for the question. I know you're also very passionate about this as well. I think at a local level, I can speak to what's happening in Sydney, just with the YCS and the YCW. I guess we're really being led and guided by, at least in a secondary education system, we're being led and guided by what is important to young people in those spaces. So even a couple of years ago, I recall there being a very specific social inquiry and that connected to Laudato Si and connected to the Care for Our Common Home. More recently, I know that there have been discussions about gender justice, which we know is also systematically connected and rooted in the climate justice campaign as well. But I think we can certainly, there's always room to be more intentional about those conversations and about those inquiries. I think at a tertiary level, where Stefan mentioned this as well about the Catholic chaplains, it is difficult to get a chance or a seat at the table when it comes to engaging in universities. Although in Perth and Melbourne, those types of conversations are happening at this stage, not specifically around Laudato Si, just about getting a chance to engage with young people in the first place. But I think Laudato Si and even just conversations about climate justice, about sustainability and environmentalism are usually core subjects when it comes to finding issues that are relevant to young people. So that leaves us with lots of space open to tackle that in those settings as well. I hope that answers that question. I had something else that I wanted to say, but I got so excited I've forgotten it.
Thank you for that, Marilyn. Bill, did you have any reflections on that at all? No? Okay. We have a question from Greg Smith, and we'll have this as our final question for tonight. A door knock from Joe Bell and Stephen Kelly was my entry to the YCW in the late 90s. It's a different world now. How are young workers connecting with the YCW? What is drawing people in?
That's a really great question. Thank you for asking that. And I think I think Nicole, our youth engagement officer from Melbourne YCW, has already tried tackling that conversation as well. I think it's important to note, obviously going through COVID-19 and lockdowns, a whole bunch of lockdowns, it has been difficult to engage with young people, at least in ways that we were used to in the past. I know it's easy to assume that young people are just very tech savvy, but it's important to note that depending on your own socioeconomic place in society as well, the areas that you grew up in, whether you've come from a temporary visa holding background as well, that tech access and tech literacy isn't always it isn't always just natural to young people, but I think many people just assume that because we've grown up in an era of technology. But in saying that, I guess that just sets some important context for how we have tried to respond to the needs of young people during this global pandemic, both last year and this year. And there have been a whole variety of ways in which we've tried to engage with young people through online platforms, digital organizing, and more recently, our national community organizer has organized training sessions for young people around digitally organizing and engaging with young people. And so that was just one of the ways in which we know is relevant and meaningful to young people. But I think it's also important to note that while that might have been our really a fundamental way in which young people we were able to reach out to and connect with young people that perhaps we'd not reached out to before, it's not been easy to do that over the past 2 years. Just because everything's been online doesn't mean that people have been in the right headspace. Often we have people being fatigued from having to meet online, and these are important considerations that we've had to take in mind, important barriers that we've had to address in trying to continue to engage with young people in meaningful and relevant ways, albeit via Zoom and GoToMeeting and I guess fun ways to socialize. A more specific response to that question, and perhaps an example, is acknowledging that through our sort of smaller group discussions that were happening online throughout the pandemic, recognizing the prevalence of mental illness and mental health concerns rising as a result of social isolation. It's been really important to us to listen to young people and understand that they don't just want, sometimes what they don't want is just to have talk fests online. Sometimes they just want to have fun and play a game with their friends because they can't do it in person at the moment. And where that's been the case, we've tried to organize social gatherings. There have been some really weird ones and some really awesome ones, even cooking online, which was a really wonderful initiative organized by some of our young leaders in Melbourne. And I guess in other places, we've had poetry groups online to be able to articulate and help young people express their emotions in particularly difficult situations whilst being in lockdown. So those have been some of the ways in which we've utilized technology to be able to support our engagement with young people. But it's definitely had its limitations and barriers. And I guess digital organizing and digital engagement with young people is not the be all and end all of youth engagement or youth formation. I think we still definitely need to meet in person and to just be able to connect and have those interpersonal relationships as well. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much for that, Marilyn. Bill, did you have any reflections?
Yeah.
Sorry, you're on mute, Bill.
I was saying a bit old to be for that. No, I think what I said before is that it's seeking out where young people are gathering together. I mean, again, reflecting back on my day, there was often a debate about whether YCW should be running football competitions and dances and all the rest of it. You know, they thought that wasn't the real YCW. Well, that's true. It's not the real YCW in a sense, but it was a way of capturing, if you like, young people and coming together. Now, how young people come together today is far beyond me, and Marilyn's answer has answered a lot of that. But there does have to be ways in which you encourage young people to come together for whatever reasons they want to come together. And that's the beginning. That's the door knock that was mentioned. But of course, it's a much more difficult world to do that sort of thing in today, because again, I go back to something I think I tried to say in the talk. So much is done for young people or to young people. You know, no longer can you just go and have a casual game of football, or no longer can you do things for yourself. It's already organized and somebody else is organizing it, and that makes it very difficult. And those that fall out of that are the ones that are really in danger.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. And thank you very much to everyone out there who sent in the questions for our panelists. I'd like to now pass over to Stefan Gigas for some closing words from the Australian Cardijn Institute.
Thank you very much, Sean. And thanks also to Bill and to Marilyn. They were both fantastic presentations. I'm closer to Bill's generation, but there were a lot of things there that struck chords with me. And as I mentioned earlier, I also feel somehow close to the current generation through the experience of my daughter. So I think, all I can say is the YCW is as important today as it's ever been, if not more important. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do whatever we can to support the movement in every way that's possible. I see in the chat there, Greg Lopez has mentioned in the YCW sense, we need to leave with an action. So perhaps I'll take that as a cue myself. What is the action that we could take following this meeting? Well, I think there's one thing that we're trying to do as the Australian Cardijn Institute, and that is to make input into the Australian Plenary Council. So if there's anybody like to work with us or give us suggestions on how we can bring up these young workers' issues to bring greater awareness to the church of it, that's one thing we are already working on, and we're very happy to work with the YCW on. Second thing, which has been mentioned several times tonight, is this question of alumni support. I think we do need a concrete action on that. I see Paul Lenton was the one who raised the issue of fundraising. Well, I'll dob myself in, Paul, if you're still there. I'm willing to talk to you, and hope maybe there's a couple of others here in this meeting tonight to see what we can come up with on that issue. I think I was international treasurer, so I know the struggles of what it is to raise money. And if you don't mind, I'll also dob in YCW Holdings. I saw Tim was there earlier. I think Holdings can really play a role here, just as Holdings did in the early days of the meeting, before it was even called Holdings, running raffles to support. They even raffled the second Holden car off the production line to raise money for the YCW back in the 1940s. So I think we need to put our heads together and see what's the way in which we can do something like that in the future today. I'm also working with Steve Kelly, who's I think here online as well. We received a request from a young guy in Malawi. Talk about the problems of the YCW here in Australia. Their young workers are earning $50 a week. He's unemployed, he's an accountant. He's trying to set up a mill, a mill that you mill grain as an employment project for himself and other people in his local area. So Steve and I are working on that. If anybody'd like to join us in that, in kind of a Joseph's International Solidarity. There's also many others doing similar things. Bernadette McAvoy was national president after me, working in East Timor with Jenny Lauritsen, doing fantastic work. So I think there's many other avenues, and I think we have to find a way to come together to support the movement in all it's doing today. But anyway, thanks very much to everybody for what you are doing, because I think it's enormous, especially what the YCW is doing. And we're just listening to what Marilyn has said. And just the last thing I'd like to say, I noticed it on the web this morning. I should have thought of it myself. Today's the death anniversary. He was killed of a young Mexican Jesuit priest called Miguel Pro. I put the link in the chat there. He actually attended the first National Congress of the YCW in 1925 before returning to Mexico. I won't tell you his whole story, except I'll say if he hadn't been killed, he probably would have been a founder, if not the founder of the YCW in Mexico. And I think that's part of our tradition that we also need to kind of regain. There's so many martyrs, and literally we're all supposed to be saints according to St. Paul, but we also have some big ass saints come out of the movement. And I think we have to put them out there and make people aware of what an incredible tradition that we have as the Joseph's movements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Stefan. In closing our webinar tonight, I would like to thank you all again for joining us in celebrating the 80th anniversary of the YCW Down Under, for your continued and ongoing solidarity with the young workers in Australia today. I would also like to acknowledge on behalf of the Australian YCW, our partners, YCW Holdings, the Australian Cardijn Institute, and Cardijn Communities Australia. I would also like to thank YCW Camp Phillip Island for all your ongoing support. Thank you. To close off tonight, I invite you to join us in the YCW closing prayer to pray and reflect. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, teach me to be generous, to serve as you deserve to be served, to give without counting the cost, to fight without counting the wounds, to work without seeking rest, to spend my life without expecting any other return than the knowledge that I do your holy will. Amen. Joseph Cardijn, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And thank you all for joining us tonight. If the panelists would like to say goodbye as well. Marilyn, Bill, Stefan.
Thanks,
Thanks for the
everyone.
opportunity. Great to be here. Thanks, Sean.
It's been awesome, and thanks, Sean, for chairing tonight's conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and please feel free to reach out to any of us. I think we've got a few of your contact details, so we'll also try and follow up on any actions from this conversation as well. Really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Marilyn. Thanks, Stefan, and everybody. Bye.
And for all of you who left your contact details with us, we thank you for that, and we will be in contact with you. Good night.
Good night.
Take care, everyone.